When you look at the seven churches of Asia in the book of Revelation, they kind of break down into three categories. Two of the churches have nothing good to say about them. Two of the churches have nothing bad to say about them. The other three are a combination of the two. Today, in this lesson, we're going to see one of the totally bad and one of the totally good churches. And the first of the two churches is found there in Revelation chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. And I think that this might, to a certain extent, be one of the saddest letters that is given. But it says, "Write to the angel in the church at Sardis, the one who has the seven spirits of God and the seven stars, says, I know your works. You have a reputation for being alive, but you are dead. Be alert and strengthen what remains, which is about to die, for I have not found your works complete before my God. Remember, therefore, what you have received and heard. Keep it and repent. But if you are not alert, I will come like a thief, and you will have no idea at what hour I come against you. But you have a few people in Sardis who have not defiled their clothes, and they will walk with me in white because they are worthy. In the same way, the victor will be dressed in white clothes, and I will never erase his name from the book of life, but will acknowledge his name before my Father and before his angels. Anyone who has an ear should listen to what the Spirit says to the churches." Sardis was about 30 miles south of Thyatira. We talked about Thyatira in the previous lesson, and you may recall that, as we mentioned there, Thyatira was a city that produced a lot of wool and had a huge dyeing industry. Dyeing as in changing the color of cloth. But Sardis was about 30 miles from there. It was the capital of the region known as Lydia. And Sardis was actually the trading center for the wool and the dye, while Thyatira had a lot of guilds, and those guilds would be responsible for transporting the wool and the cloth and the dyed material down to Sardis, and from Sardis they would bring in other supplies back to the city. But the city of Sardis, being a trading hub, a major trading hub, trading center, it had a very luxurious and morally loose society. Their culture was fairly a loose, morally a loose society. And now, when you deal with the actual church itself, from all outward appearances, people would think that the church was very active, and thriving. Most likely, the church had a lot of activities, a lot of stuff going on. They were doing a lot of stuff. Most of that, however, was probably social in its nature, and as such, while it looked like it was thriving, while it looked like it was very active, while it looked like it was doing something, in reality, this church was spiritually dead and lifeless. There was no power in the church. They weren't actively engaging in ministry. No lives were being changed. No spiritual growth was happening, let alone people actually getting saved and coming to know the Lord. This is the first of two churches to receive no commendation. It only receives condemnation. But what we see in this church is something that's very important to understand, and that's having activities is not a measure of the health of a church. Not really. And don't misunderstand. The point is not, should we have activities or should we not? There's no condemnation about having activities. There's no problem with a church having fellowship and having different activities for the people and for the community. None of that is a problem. There's nothing wrong with that. But just because a church has a lot of activities doesn't mean that a church is healthy. And what we're going to see as we look at these two different churches today is we're going to see the contrast. The church at Thyatira was probably fairly large, probably attracted a lot of people because of the stuff that it did. But Jesus looks at it and says, everyone looks at you and thinks that you're alive, but in reality you're dead. There was, and he says there it's and even that which is still alive, even that which is still hanging on, it's about to go as well. I kind of have a picture of a tree that the core of it, the heart of it has gone rotten, and the tree is dying, and you can see as various branches, most of the branches are dead and starting to go, and then there's that one little new branch, that one little green shoot, but you know that it's not going to survive because the rest of the tree is collapsing, the rest of the tree is dying, the rest of the tree is basically dead. That's what's happening with the church at Thyatira, or at the church at Sardis. There was a few things where there was still some level of life, but not really much. And there was and the few faithful saints that were there, because apparently there were still a few people. Jesus says that there's a few in Sardis who have not defiled their clothes. He says, strengthen what remains, which is about to die. There was apparently some little spark of life left in the church. And Jesus he encourages them to keep that which is still alive, which still remains, keep it alive. Though the rest of the church was dead by all indications. I kind of remember as I share this lesson that growing up we would oftentimes go up into the Rocky Mountains and go camping, and a lot of time, and we would always have a big campfire, and of course we'd get up early, usually around the time the sun comes up, but we would stay up until after it was dark out. But there were a number of times I remember where we'd get up and the coals from the fire from the night before were still hot. There was still some sparks there. The fire, to look at it, it was just ash. It was just dust. But there would still be one or two deep inside these coals that were still there. And amazingly, you could restore the fire from just those few coals. You could bring back the fire. And this is what Jesus comes in and he tells the church, like the church at Ephesus that we saw in a previous lesson. This church is exhorted to remember the what they had received at the beginning. He says, remember therefore what you have received and heard, keep it and repent. He says, what you need to do is you need to go back to the what. The what is it that you received? It was your salvation. It was Jesus Christ. What did you hear? You heard about him. You heard about the gospel. You had the teachings that came in about him and about how the church is supposed to be, how it's supposed to act, how it's supposed to operate. Go back and return to that. Start blowing on those hot coals to restore the fire. And go back to where you were at the beginning. See, one of the most important things I think that we can do sometimes is, especially the longer we've been saved, the older we get, is to try and go back and recapture that joy and that excitement that we once possessed. He says that you need to be alert. You need to be watching out. Because the Lord's coming and you need to be prepared. This is the warning. He says, listen, you need to get ready because one of these days, Jesus Christ is going to call you home. And when he does, you're going to have to give an account to him. And you want to be ready when that day comes. And here we have, as we look at this church, we also see one of the greatest warning signs that something is going wrong. And it's a loss of passion. See, a loss of passion for the things of God should cause us to fear for our spiritual health. Just like in the medical field, there are certain warning signs that if you start to see these, if you start having these issues, even if they just seem very, very mild, you're encouraged. Don't waste time. Call 911. Go to the hospital. If you start having some pain in your left arm, there's that concern that you're going to be having a heart attack. If you see someone who's showing some slight drooping in their face or some other issues, inability to move, to get on the phone, call 911 right away because the person might be having a stroke. Deep, inexplicable pain, you should go in because that could be a major issue. There are certain things, certain warning signs in our health that should cause us to immediately say, there is a problem. I need to go to the hospital. I need to go see the doctor. I need to do something here. And just in the physical realm, that's the case. Spiritually, that's the case. And if you are losing your passion for the things of God, you need to stop and say, hey, how is my spiritual health really, really doing? Because if you don't have a passion for the things of God, then there's a problem. You probably need to get a little spiritual medicine, if you will. You probably need to go back to where you were at the beginning and remember what happened at the beginning, what you encountered, what was given to you in terms of your salvation, in terms of your relationship with Jesus Christ, who you were before and who you are now. Because if you don't have a passion for the things of God, then you're spiritually on your way towards death. I don't mean that you can lose your salvation, but you can cease to be active, cease to be effective, cease to be of any good, if you will. And that brings us to the second church in verse 7. It says, write to the angel to the church in the church of Philadelphia, the Holy One, the true one, the one who has the key of David, who opens and no one will close, who closes and no one opens, says, I know your works. Because you have limited strength, have kept my word, and have not denied my name. Look, I have placed before you an open door that no one is able to close. Take note, I will make those from the synagogue of Satan who claim to be Jews and are not, but are lying. Note this, I will make them come and bow down at your feet, and they will know that I have loved you, because you have kept my command to endure. I will also keep you from the hour of testing that's going to come over the whole world to test those who live on the earth. I am coming quickly. Hold on to what you have so that no one takes your crown. The victor, I will make him a pillar in the sanctuary of my God, and he will never go out again. I will write on him the name of my God and the name of my city, name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and my new name. Anyone who has an ear should listen to what the Spirit says to the churches. So you come to the city of Philadelphia. The name Philadelphia means brotherly love. It is the modern day city of Philadelphia in the state of Pennsylvania is named after this city. That's why it has why it's called the city of brotherly love, because that's literally what the name Philadelphia means. And the city of Philadelphia was a relatively minor city. It's at about 28 miles southeast of Sardis, and the city itself, its predominant religion focused on the worship of Dionysus. Dionysus was the Greek god of wine, and the worship of Dionysus, as you might suspect, included a great deal of drunkenness and debauchery. And so you can kind of guess that when the vast majority of the people worship Dionysus, and they are religiously engaged in basically alcoholism and other forms of moral decay, you can imagine what the culture of the city was, because all of that was promoted as being good moral values. The church there in Philadelphia, we see that it is a church that there is no condemnation on it. This is actually the second church that we've looked at that has no condemnation, but the church of Smyrna was the first one. But this church had remained faithful to the Lord insofar as it was able. And the reason I say insofar as it was able is because we have here clear indication that the church was small. He says, I know your works, because you have limited strength, have kept my word, and have not denied my name. In other words, what he's saying is, you as a church have very little strength. You have very little ability and capacity to make much of a difference. Your size prohibits you from being all that powerful. And yet the church had heavily relied on the power of God in its operations. And Jesus is giving them a commendation because of the fact that despite their size, because of their limited strength, because of their weakness, especially in comparison to a church like what we saw at Sardis, the Sardis, by all accounts, by all appearances, was big, was growing, was thriving, and yet ministerially was dead. The church at Philadelphia, however, was very small, but was very much alive, was very active. And Jesus says, he says, I have this open door. I have an open door that no one is able to close. And it doesn't matter what's going on in the city. It doesn't matter what happens. No one's going to stop that. Basically, what he is saying here is that when he talks about the open door, the implication of the open door is that God kept providing this church with opportunities of service. And they weren't letting the opportunities go by. Those opportunities would come up and they would seize them. Those doors would open up and they'd go right through. This church was eager to move forward, eager to serve, was eager to follow Jesus Christ. You see, what we see is really in the church of Philadelphia, we see the exact opposite of what we see in Sardis. And we have this great principle that the size of a church is not an indicator of its health, but rather it holding to the word. You see, the church at Philadelphia was a small church. It was a relatively weak church from a human perspective, and yet it had faithfully endured. It had faithfully stayed true, faithfully stayed pure to the things of God, and as such, it proved to be far more effective, and it was a church that Jesus heavily praises. And again, you see the clear contrast between Philadelphia and Sardis here. Sardis, from all outwards appearance, is big, it's thriving, it's growing. Philadelphia is small, it's weak, probably going to die. And yet, from the perspective of God, it's just the opposite. Sardis is barely alive, and yet Philadelphia is very much alive. Because Philadelphia is jumping on the opportunities. They are engaging, they are serving, they are doing the work and holding on to the word and holding on to the truth and serving when the opportunities arise. And in the church of Philadelphia, we see that there's persecution. He talks again about the synagogue of Satan. We talked about that before with some of the previous churches. The synagogue of Satan were those Jews that had specifically targeted Christians, early Christians, and saw them as heretics and tried to harm them. And that synagogue of Satan, there was a lot of persecution, a lot of push against this church, a lot of people trying to do harm to it. And it's interesting, again, you note that in the church of Philadelphia, we're specifically told that there was persecution. On the other hand, when you look at the church at Sardis, there is no persecution. There's no reference to persecution. See, persecution is seen when a church is active and faithful, not when it isn't serving. See, the simple truth is the more active a church becomes, and this is also comes down even to the personal level of the membership of the church, the more active any Christian is, and thus any church is, in terms of serving the Lord, remaining faithful, holding fast to what's true and what's right, and engaging in those opportunities, the more a church does that, the more pushback there's going to be. A church like Sardis, Satan doesn't care about. They're not doing anything. They're doing about as much good as a bump on a log. They just are not serving any purpose. A church like Philadelphia, there's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of pressing against, because that church is engaging in faithfulness and in service, even if the church is not growing massively large. That's why we noted earlier in this lesson that the size of a church is not the determining factor of whether it's healthy or not. The world looks at the size and says, oh wow, look at that church. It has thousands of, not tens of thousands of members. That church must be really on fire. That church must really be working for the Lord. Not necessarily. And by the way, I'm not saying that just because a church is big that means that it's that there's something wrong with it. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the size of a church has no relation whatsoever to its spiritual health. But if you see pressure coming against it, if you have problems that keep popping up, if you have issues, if you have attacks that keep coming up and hardships that are happening among the membership, then that's an indicator that there's good things happening in the church, as weird as it might sound. And if you look at these two letters, you have this interesting statement. In the first one, he says the victor will be dressed in white and his name will never be removed from the book of life. That's not a threat. It's rather a promise. It's a promise that salvation is eternal, that once you are saved, you cannot lose your salvation. In the second letter, it says that he will become a pillar in the temple, in the sanctuary of my God. In other words, God's not going to get rid of you. Once you're there, once you are in the family, you are there. But Jesus does offer this warning. In verse 11, he said, I am coming quickly. Hold on to what you have so that no one takes your crown. He's not warning about the loss of salvation. He's warning about the loss of rewards. You see, Jesus Christ wants to reward his own for their faithfulness, for their service. His own are saved. And while salvation cannot be lost, rewards can be. And so we need to be aware that if we start ceasing to be faithful, if we cease to serve the Lord right and properly, we could potentially lose rewards that have been laid up in heaven. And you look at these two churches, and the warning to the church at Sardis is, you're about to die in sin. The challenge to the church at Philadelphia is, keep on. Stay steady, stay true, because if you falter, if you fail, you could lose rewards. That's not to say that just because you mess up once here, once there, you have a sin, falter, and failure here. That doesn't mean that the heavenly accountants are saying, "Oh well, gotta find so and so for that." No, but the Bible is clear that when we go before the judgment seat of Christ, And remember, the judgment seat of Christ is about rewards. And Paul tells us that there's going to be some people who go before the judgment seat of Christ, and they're going to receive many, 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 many rewards. And then there's going to be some people who go before the judgment seat of Christ, some believers who stand before the judgment seat of Christ, and they're going to get there. They're going to be smelling of smoke. They're going to be there, but they're not going to have any rewards. Hold on to what you have in this life, in this place, right here, right now. Strengthen what remains. Get that passion back into the roaring fire. And grab the opportunities when they arise. That's what denotes spiritual health. Thank you for joining in on this Bible study. If you have not done so, please like and share this video so that we can share God's Word. We would also like to ask you to subscribe to our channel here and check us out on Facebook. And if you're in the Fort Worth area, know that you're always welcome to join us for any of our services and Bible study.